I'm Henry Timon, conducting a walking tour of Woodlawn Cemetery. Today's program is courtesy of Franklin Monument Company of Norwalk. Woodlawn Cemetery is owned and operated by the Norwalk Cemetery Association, now with about 56 acres of land, approximately 16,000 burials. There are veterans buried here from every American war, from the Revolutionary War, even up through Desert Storm. 5 U.S. congressmen who are Jay Lanning, Dudley White, Hosea Townsend, Stephen M. Young, and Charles Wickham. And there's one other U.S. congressman buried in the Episcopal Cemetery. So we have 6 members of Congress who rest here. We have 2 Medal of Honor winners buried in Woodlawn. One is in the mausoleum here behind me, entombed, Charles Stacy, who was a sharpshooter at the Battle of Gettysburg. The other is Jay Williams. This monument is for Henry Bly and his wife. He rose to the rank of colonel in the Civil War. His wife, when she passed away, was well remembered by the soldiers because she had come to the camp and took care of them in the hospital. And on the monument is this telegram that was sent to her husband when she died. 256 words cut in there by a stonecutter at the time. This marker also has symbolism of mourning. The wreath is a sign of victory. It's a sign of victory over death, and it's a common Grecian form, but it was not used much yet in this time period, but was put here. And the clasped hands have a symbol of one of those hands is male and one is female, the cuff on them. They mean that a person is reaching from heaven to take hold of their partner's hand and help them across. And that symbol is commonly seen on earlier markers, but very seldom on one this recent. This monument is typical of many you'll see here at Woodlawn with this shaft. That is a symbol of sunshine, that is letting that sunshine coming down onto the cemetery, onto the place of burial. And it has around the top here veil, a cloth. That cloth or veil is a symbol that as when we're living we cannot see God. There's a veil between us and heaven, and when we pass away the veil is lifted and we see everything and it becomes clear. And I'd like to mention one other thing, this marker with GAR on it. GAR was the American Legion of the Civil War. The veterans after the war formed a fraternal organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. And every time a Civil War veteran died, a GAR flagstaff was put at his grave. And we'll see a number of them today. Here is the monument for Jay Williams, our other Medal of Honor winner. He served in the Spanish-American War in the Navy, and then afterwards he stayed in the United States Navy and was in the Far East during the Boxer Rebellion in China, which was about 1900 or 1901. And for his service there, he received the Medal of Honor. And it's this little symbol right here on the monument denotes a Medal of Honor recipient. When he retired, for some reason, returned or came to Norwalk, passed away here in the 1930s. I just wanted to stop here and point out this statue. These were very common around in the 1890s, 1900. They were sometimes quarried and created in Italy. This type of monument was very popular in the Victorian era, especially in the 1880s, 1890s. They loved everything woodsy. And this, of course, you see, it looks like it's a tree trunk. It has a morning glory vine twining around it, and even the headstones look like pieces of wood. And these were sold by, I think, Sears. You could order them from their catalog and have them engraved and shipped to you. And then you, of course, had the responsibility of getting them put up in the local cemetery. But there are a number of these around the cemetery. Some of them, and it states on them, were put up by a lodge called Woodmen of the World. But that was a fraternal lodge. But they were not, those markers are not nearly as fancy as this, with all the flowers and the bark on the tree and so forth. Nelson Swan lived here in Norwalk. He was a young man, but the interesting part of his marker is it says Nelson Swan entered into spirit life on such and such a date after an earth life of so many years. And it makes me wonder whether he was a spiritualist. This is one of the stops on the self-guided walking tour. It has the white post here as a reminder of that. It's the burial place of a man named Frank D. Reed, who died here in Norwalk in 1891. Frank Reed was, of course, the first American child born in what is now Huron County. Just at the beginning of the War of 1812, he was raised here in the wilderness. Many of his playmates were American Indian children, and with them he spent a lot of time in the woods. He learned how to hunt and fish and trap and build a fire and find shelter and find his way around, learned the signs of how to determine which direction is which direction. And he spent most of his life in the woods, but he married and had a family, and he died in Norwalk about 1891. This small marker is where Mrs. Lucina Norton is buried. Mrs. Lucina Norton was one of a group that was called Mothers in Israel. And they went out when there was sickness in the neighborhood. And in the 1800s, there were no hospitals. And if there was a hospital, there was no way to get a patient to it because the roads were mud. And if it was wet weather, they were terrible mud. And so they took care of sick people at home as best they could. And she was one of them who would go take care of the sick, soothe the dying people, and when they had died, they would get them ready for burial. They would clean them, dress them, comb their hair, and so forth. And also, they delivered the babies, and they just, in general, went at a moment's notice and tended to a sick person. Well, there was a little girl had died in the neighborhood of diphtheria, which is a very, very virulent, contagious disease. And Mrs. Norton was combing the little girl's hair. They were getting her ready for the funeral at home, and she was combing her hair, but Mrs. Norton did not realize she had an open sore on her finger, and some of the diphtheria germs got in there and killed her too. So she died in action. She was acting as a mother in Israel and lost her life over that. This is also a stop on the self-guided walking tour. It's the burial place of Abner Baker of Norwalk. He is one of 3 Revolutionary War veterans buried here at Woodlawn. Each of them, when they first passed away, was buried in the old Episcopal Cemetery on West Main Street. And after Woodlawn was developed and family lots were purchased, as we'll see, there's a large family lot here of Abner Baker's descendants, and these veterans were moved from the old cemetery to the new. This also is a stop on the self-guided tour. This is where the very first burial took place here at Woodlawn Cemetery. A little boy named Herbert Barnhart, and he died in the summer of 1854 and was, as I say, was the very first burial. This is another stop that's on the self-guided tour. Very small monument to a very important couple in Norwalk's history, William Gallup and his wife Sally Bolt. William and Sally Gallup were married in 1819 on the farm where the cemetery is now. Her father owned it at that time, John Bolt, B-O-A-L-T. And they lived here in Norwalk for a few years, then they moved to the Dayton area. And when they got older and were making their plans for their funerals and burials, they decided they wanted to be buried back in Norwalk, where they had started out life together. A lot was purchased and they were brought back and buried there on that same farm that had been her father's home, the same farm where they were married in 1819. This is an unusual type of monument. There are 3 or 4 here at Woodlawn. They are made of what they called white bronze, and they were very popular before World War I. I've heard, but I don't know, that they quit making them because of the war effort in World War I. They needed the alloys with it for the war effort. But this one I like because it has such symbolism. The drape is at the top, wreath, the swag and wreath. Here's the anchor, over here is a dove of peace, and so on. Many symbols of life and death and Bible. And they were made so that these plates, when a person died, if they were buried here and they needed an inscription, they could get a new plate made, take this one out, put the new plate on, and everything was in order. This monument is to the memory of Amelia Dodge Fletcher Southard. She was a true daughter of the American Revolution. Her father served in the Revolutionary War, and she and her family had a long and very interesting story. She lived to be 90 almost, and died here in Norwalk in 1910. The DAR just really thought she was very special. They were very good to her. They put up that the marker for her at Woodlawn. This is another one of those tree monuments. I really enjoy seeing these. I think they're so interesting. But you can see it's like the one we saw before with the vine growing on it and the bark, and down here are ferns around the base of it. As I said, these could be ordered from the catalog and shipped to you, and then you had them put in place. This woodsy marker is near the original Veterans Lot and belonged to the Gamby family, who lived here in Norwalk and who had a nursery here. They raised flowers and vegetable plants and so forth, ornamental trees and what have you. And they were just, the monuments were, they looked like a tree trunk. They had bark on them and vines, and had some ferns growing around the bottom. They were just typical of Victorian times, when people wanted everything to have leaves on it. They enjoyed ornate decoration like that. And those could be ordered out of the catalog, and you could get them sent to you, and then I guess you did the inscription when they got here. This is what we call at the cemetery the old Veterans Lot. In about 1885, the state of Ohio passed a law that the county commissioners were responsible for burying indigent veterans and providing a place for them. And the cemetery donated this lot, and these are almost all Civil War soldiers buried here. At the far side of the Veterans Lot here, there is a cannon, but it is not government issue, it's not government ordinance. It was made here in Norwalk when we had the railroad shops. The men who worked there melted down some scrap iron and cast it. And then every 4th of July and every Memorial Day and whatever holiday, they'd fire the thing off about 5 o'clock in the morning and wake up the whole town. Fire department didn't want it anymore, so they gave it to the cemetery. So it's here guarding the Veterans Lot. I wanted to mention here the statue on top of this large monument. The statue itself has I told you, everyone has a name. This one is named Despair. You can see it's a woman mourning. She's holding a wreath, and so she is grieving in despair. After the Civil War, it became very popular to build mausoleums. Some people had a fear of being put in the ground after they had passed away. And Mr. and Mrs. Backerstock, who built this mausoleum in 1889, had no children. They wanted to be remembered. And when I was a little kid and the doors would be open, their portraits hung inside, I presume are still in there. They also had a rocking chair so that if you came out here, you could sit and think about them for a while. Probably noticed along this avenue was kind of the main street of the cemetery. This was large monuments, nice lots with stone steps and walls. This one is to the memory of Moses Worcester, who was a lieutenant colonel in an Ohio regiment during the Civil War. He died at the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee. When they got word that he was wounded, his brother started down there and had to go by railroad, steamboat, and so on. When he got there, Moses had died, so he brought the body back to Norwalk, and he was buried here at Woodlawn. This changed the mind of many people who were opposed to the Civil War because they thought, well, it's just a bunch of guys going out and shooting at each other. But when they realized that officers could be killed as well as enlisted men, they began to think we better do something to support this war and get it over with. And this is a monument to the memory of Moses Fairchild Worcester. This is the Cole family lot here at Woodlawn. We believe it to be the largest family lot. There are supposed to be 39 burials and 43 monuments. The original family burial ground was on their farm out in the southwest corner of Norwalk Township, but in the 1870s they moved the burials there to Woodlawn and established this, and I guess everybody was friends, so they stayed together. Two of the people buried there is a descendant named Sterry Cole and his wife Atchsa. They had a daughter named Edith Mayora Cole, married first to someone else, but married second to Coach John Heisman, the football coach. And they had gone to college together and were engaged, and she got sick and she released him from the engagement. He married somebody else, she eventually married somebody else. Both became single again, married each other, and lived in Wisconsin. And she lived to a great age, 97 years old, something like that. And she preserved a trunk, a large trunk full of Heisman memorabilia and documents and things, and that went to a grandnephew or something of Coach Heisman, who lives near Toledo, Ohio. And a nice book was written a few years ago about Heisman's coaching career. He first coached after he went to college in Akron, and then he first coached at Oberlin College right over here a few miles away from us. Here is where General Frank Sawyer is buried. He was a Civil War officer, a lawyer from Norwalk, but became an officer during the war, and he is buried here with his family. Has a nice new government marker thanks to the staff at Woodlawn Cemetery a few years ago. When the Civil War broke out, the government didn't have an officer candidate school, or of course some guys went to West Point, but Frank Sawyer was one of the many who applied for an officer's commission, and if they were of the right politics and had the right friends, they became a captain or a major or something like that just by a letter written. They were all of a sudden an officer able to command troops and take care of a regiment. And he was part of the 8th Ohio Regiment, which was, some of it was recruited around Norwalk here. They ended up being at Gettysburg, and one of the last parts of the Battle of Gettysburg was General Pickett was ordered to lead a charge across the wheat field and break the Union line. And he knew he couldn't do it, he knew it wouldn't work, but he did it because he was ordered to. And it was a great loss of life, and no, he did not break the line. But there's a monument there, which I saw several years ago, commemorating the fact that end of the line, one end of the line, was held by the 8th Ohio by Frank Sawyer, was the commander. and they held that line, and that was the end of the Battle of Gettysburg. These stones stand out to me because they have a symbol of mourning on them. As you can see, it's pretty worn, but it's a weeping willow. It means there was a sign of great weeping for these people, great mourning. And many times in older cemeteries you'll see the weeping willow tree. They do represent a sign of mourning for the people who have passed away. I consider this to be probably the outstanding piece of art in the cemetery. It's a Celtic cross, as you can see, and was erected to the memory of the family of Darwin and Sarah Gardner. Darwin Gardner was born here in Norwalk in 1820. He was a businessman in Toledo when he died in 1867, and he specified in his instructions that he be buried here at Woodlawn, that they take dirt from the lot where he had been born, the property, and dirt enough to put in the bottom of the grave, put the casket on it, then fill the grave up with that dirt so that he would be reunited with the dirt from where he had started out in life. And that was done. I believe this may have been put up in later years. It just somehow doesn't strike me as an 1867 monument. Members of his family are buried here, his wife and children. I consider to be a genuine treasure, and I always look at the trees around it, but so far so good. This is one of the stops on the self-guided tour. It's the burial place of James Williams, who was the first mayor of Norwalk, and his wife Sarah, and several of their children, including their son Theodore. And the Williamses have a long story in connection with Norwalk. James Williams and his wife Sarah are buried here. He was the first lawyer to settle in Norwalk, and eventually 10 years later was the first mayor of the town. He was involved in a good many business deals and betterment of the town. He was on boards and working toward better schools and active in his church and so forth. He and his wife had a son named Theodore. Theodore Williams was the first American boy born in the village of Norwalk. This is the receiving vault here at Woodlawn Cemetery. It was built in 1879 after a lot of complaints by the newspaper people and by the general citizens, because every grave had to be dug when the person died, regardless of what the weather was. And they finally got to where one day 2 men were going to dig a grave, and it took them all day with axes and picks to dig that grave because the ground was frozen so deep. And the cemetery board decided, well, it's time we build a receiving vault. A Norwalk contractor named John Parker built it. It's all, of course, sandstone and has great detail to it. Unfortunately, it's outlived its usefulness because we don't have to worry about digging anymore. With power tools, it can be done. This would hold 36 burials. Sometimes it was full because sometimes they'd bring them in from out in the country. They couldn't dig. It was snowy or too cold to dig out in the rural cemeteries, so they'd bring them here to keep them. At the time of the blizzard in 1978 in northern Ohio, there were 7 caskets stored in the main mausoleum up there where we started today. Some were burials here, some were burials in the Catholic cemetery in Norwalk, some were, I think there were 1 or 2 from out in the country of the cases where they just could not get in to dig a grave and bury someone. This is the Goodnow family lot. Now here in Norwalk, I always have heard the name pronounced Goodnow, but if you ask a descendant, they'll say it's Goodnow, but you can see how it's spelled. Mr. Milton Goodnow, I'm standing here by his monument, was a merchant in Norwalk, and he spent so much time in the store that he contracted COPD, lung trouble, from not getting enough fresh air and all the dust and dirt of merchandising. and he heard of a place in Texas where people went to be healed of such things. So he and someone else traveled down there, arrived all right, but unfortunately he died a couple weeks later. They buried him, sent word back to Mrs. Goodnow. She said, well, I want him buried in Norwalk. So her brother, the family fortunately was affluent enough they could afford it, her brother went down there. They disinterred the body. They had to take it to a river, put it on a steamboat, take it down to the Gulf of Mexico, put it on an ocean-going boat to go to New Orleans, to come up the Mississippi to Cincinnati. When they got there, they stored the body in a church vault until wintertime. Then they got on the railroad and came up to Monroeville. He was brought and buried in the Episcopal Cemetery in Norwalk, and then when Woodlawn became popular, the family wanted everybody moved out here, so they did. These are the monuments for the founders of our town, Platt Benedict and his wife Sally DeForest. They came to Norwalk in 1817 and lived the remainder of their lives here. He died in 1866 when he was 91 years old. She died in 1852. He did everything that could be done to build up the town. He helped found the Episcopal Church. He was an early member of the Masonic Lodge. He bought blooded cattle so that the cattle herds would improve in quality. He bought the newest farm equipment so people could see how you could farm better. Anything that was an advantage to the town, Platt Benedict was involved in it. And when he died, they both were buried in the Episcopal Cemetery, in the old cemetery before. And about 10 years after his death, they were moved here with their monuments, and a number of their family members are buried back here also. Here's where Mrs. Esther Crecelius Stratton is buried. She was a teacher for many years. I remember having her as a substitute teacher in grade school. Her marker was put up with the intention that she would probably pass away in the 20th century. And you remember at the end of the 20th century, everybody thought that the world was going to come to an end and the computers were all going to crash and so forth. Well, that didn't happen, but realistically, and you can see it on here, Stonecutter had put the date 19, and then was going to fill in the date when she passed away. However, she lived until 2001. She was 106 years old when she passed away, and they had to buff down that 19 in there so they could cut the 20 across the top of it. And also, I do believe Mrs. Stratton is the oldest person buried here at Woodlawn. She was 106 years old, and I imagine she is the oldest burial that we have. This monument remembers the 21 victims of the Fitchville nursing home fire in 1963, whose remains were never claimed by any family members or who had no family members. And they were buried here courtesy of Woodlawn Cemetery and the funeral directors of Huron County. November 22nd of 1963, President John Kennedy was shot. That night, in the night, we around here had it wasn't a snowstorm, it was more like a windstorm. There was snow with it, but not much snow accumulated. Anyway, there was a building out about 5-6 miles south of Norwalk that had once been a toy factory and had been made into a nursing home by somebody. And most of the occupants of it were people who had lived most of their lives in state institutions, and when they became senile, they farmed them out, the state farmed them out to these nursing homes, and they just took care of them until they passed away. Well, that building caught fire. They believe it was electrical, because where the fire started, or where at least it appeared it started, was where the electric service came into the building. And that happened to be right over the front door, and the front door was the only one wide enough for a wheelchair to go through. There were other exit doors, but they weren't wide enough, and so they had trouble. They had to carry the people out who they could, motorists stopped, truck drivers stopped, Finally, the fire departments got called and got there and took charge. But 63 people died in that fire. 21 of those people were never claimed by anybody. No family member came forward or anything, and they buried at Woodlawn Cemetery. The cemetery donated the land, the funeral directors of the county donated the merchandise, and they had a funeral service for them about a week after that happened. Here is where Sarah Wilkinson Dunbar is buried. Sarah Wilkinson was the first graduate of Norwalk High School in 1861. She was also the valedictorian of her class, a salutatorian, the president of the National Honor Society, because she was the only person who graduated. So she was all by herself, in a field all by herself. She went on to become a teacher of elocution. When she passed away in California, was brought here and buried, but never had a monument. A few years ago, as I was finalizing this tour, I realized she didn't have a marker, and I thought, well, that's not right, because she had some influence on the city of Norwalk. So my wife and I were talking about it, and she said, well, why couldn't we do that? We could, for that price, she says, we could afford to get that marker, so we did. It's here, and on the back is the official seal of the schools of Norwalk, showing her connection with Norwalk High School. Here is the burial place of Captain James D. Wolfe, who was a Civil War soldier, who became a doctor and was serving with the 7th Cavalry with General Custer at the time of the Little Bighorn, and he was killed in that battle. For some reason, the government would not allow the remains to be removed from the battlefield for a year, so they covered them up as best they could. A year later, Mrs. D. Wolfe, who was from Norwalk, Captain D. Wolfe was not, she wanted him buried here, and so the remains were shipped here and a funeral service held. We bought this marker a few years ago at the cemetery. We realized the family marker was fading, and so we got a government marker for him. This pillar has been here for a long, long time, and it has a groove in the top of it, and that groove supposedly is true north. And in the hedge down by the road, there is another pillar like this with this same groove, and the surveyors used to come out here and line up their instruments, calibrate them by this being true north. Here is where Sam Johnson is buried. His name was Samuel, but everybody called him Sam. He was the last surviving Civil War veteran in Huron County, and he died in July of 1944. And he may have been older than Esther Stratton, but we're not sure because he was born in slavery and therefore had no record of his birth. The VA says he was 99 years old. In any case, he died here in Norwalk, was buried here. I always found it ironic that he eventually served in the Union Army and helped free the country of slavery, which he had been born in, and he worked hard for. His funeral was a big event. It happened during World War II, so not too many days after D-Day. He was a long-time figure in Norwalk. Well, that's our tour of Woodlawn Cemetery. Probably over time we'll be adding things to it. I hope you've enjoyed it, and our tour today has been made possible by Kevin and April Hipp of the Franklin Monument Company of Norwalk.